At 3:17 in the morning, the capital of Burkina Faso was silent until a single phone call shattered the night. It wasn't the sound of diplomacy, it was the sound of intimidation. On the other end of the line stood Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, delivering not a request but a threat. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was given 48 hours, either restore suspended mining contracts and reopen surveillance cooperation with Israel or face removal from power. No discussion, no negotiation, only pressure. Imagine that moment. A young African leader standing at the crossroads of sovereignty and subjugation, forced to choose between surrendering his nation's dignity or defying a global power. This was not just about contracts worth billions of dollars. It was about who truly controls Africa's destiny, its elected leaders chosen by their people, or foreign powers thousands of miles away who still view African resources as bargaining chips. The ultimatum was clear. The countdown had begun. But what would follow over those tense 48 hours would ignite something larger than any mining deal. It would spark a wave of defiance, of unity, and of global attention that few expected from a small landlocked country often dismissed as powerless. In those hours, the world would discover that Burkina Faso was no longer willing to live on its knees. So here is the question for all of us watching: will Ibrahim Traoré's stand be remembered as reckless defiance or as the first spark of an African sovereignty movement that can no longer be crushed? Stay with us as we uncover the story of these 48 hours, the midnight threat, the unyielding response, and the extraordinary lesson it carries not only for Africa, but for the entire world. And if you believe that dignity is worth more than dollars, please share this story. Subscribe if you know that the truth is always more important than the headlines. The phone call that shook Wagadugu at 3:17 a.m. was unlike any ordinary diplomatic exchange. On the other end of the line was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking not with courtesy, but with command. His words landed with the cold weight of a verdict. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had 48 hours to comply or step down. Either restore Israel's suspended mining contracts worth an estimated $1.2 billion and reopen channels of surveillance cooperation, or face consequences that went unspoken but unmistakable. This was no dialogue. It was blackmail dressed as diplomacy. For a nation like Burkina Faso, already battling poverty, terrorism, and economic strain, the stakes could not have been higher. Traoré's government had recently redirected much of the country's gold and energy wealth inward, away from foreign companies that had profited while ordinary citizens lived on less than $3 a day. Netanyahu's ultimatum threatened to undo those reforms, dragging the country back into dependency, just as it had begun to take bold steps towards sovereignty. By dawn, the president summoned his closest advisors to an emergency meeting inside the government compound. The defense minister, the head of intelligence, the foreign affairs chief, and key economic advisors gathered around a long wooden table. The air was thick with tension as Netanyahu's ultimatum was replayed aloud from the recording. Each word carried not just threat but history, the familiar echo of external powers treating Africa's leaders as subordinates. For several minutes, no one spoke. The silence itself seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Then the debate began. A senior intelligence officer was the first to break it. This is not about mining contracts. This is about dismantling sovereignty. Heads nodded. Everyone in the room knew that African leaders who defied foreign interests were often punished not with dialogue, but with destabilization sanctions and even orchestrated unrest. The pattern was as old as independence itself. Two paths quickly emerged. The first was capitulation. Traoré could resign, or at least step aside under a transitional authority, restoring foreign contracts in exchange for promises of safety. The second was resistance, to stand firm, rejecting the ultimatum and brace for whatever storm might follow: sanctions, economic sabotage, media campaigns, even political isolation. The economists in the room warned of the risks. New sanctions could shrink Burkina Faso's GDP by 4 to 6% annually. Capital flight might drain hundreds of millions from the country's fragile reserves. Aid flows could vanish overnight. On paper, surrender looked like the pragmatic choice. Yet the defense minister pushed back. "Dependence is already killing us slowly," he reminded the council. "To surrender now is to formalize our subordination." Traoré listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He was not a man given to long speeches in private, but when he finally spoke, his words cut through the tension with clarity. "Sovereignty is not a bargaining chip," he said. "Better to die standing than live on our knees." It was a declaration as much as a decision. For Traoré, the ultimatum was not simply about money or contracts. It was about dignity, about whether an African nation had the right to decide its own future without being coerced by threats from abroad. His refusal to flinch in the face of Netanyahu's ultimatum marked the beginning of a countdown that would soon grip not just Burkina Faso, but the entire continent. The ministers left the chamber with grim faces, fully aware of what lay ahead. There would be no easy days in the next 48 hours. Markets might waver, allies might hesitate, and enemies might sharpen their knives. Yet there was also something different in the air, an unspoken recognition that this confrontation could define not only Traoré's presidency, but also Africa's wider struggle for sovereignty in the 21st century. The die was cast. A small, landlocked nation had chosen to resist. What followed would not just test its endurance, but reveal whether the spirit of independence still lived in Africa's veins. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré finally responded to the midnight ultimatum, his words were steady but sharp. "I don't negotiate with extortionists." It was not anger that spoke, but conviction. In one sentence, he transformed a moment of intimidation into a declaration of principle. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso's sovereignty was not for sale. That defiance, however, did not exist in a vacuum. Almost immediately, the ripple effects spread across the globe. Traoré began reaching out to allies beyond Africa's borders, crafting a network of resistance designed to blunt the inevitable backlash. From Caracas, Venezuela came an offer of safe haven and symbolic political solidarity, a reminder that nations resisting Western pressure often turn to one another for shelter. From Tehran, Iran dispatched digital defense experts prepared to shield Burkina Faso's fragile financial system from cyber attacks that analysts estimated could otherwise drain as much as $500 million annually. Moscow's answer was more strategic. Russian military advisors quietly offered logistical training and planning support, equipping Burkina Faso to resist pressures that often began as whispers before escalating into destabilization campaigns. Beijing's contribution was economic, a proposed $1 billion emergency credit line to stabilize Burkina Faso's reserves for at least 18 months, buying the young government precious time to weather sanctions. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from foreign capitals, but from the streets of Wagadugu. As news of Netanyahu's ultimatum leaked, it did not sow fear, it ignited unity. Students marched with hand-painted banners declaring, "Our land, our choice." Farmers laid down their tools to stand shoulder to shoulder with factory workers. Market women carried pots and pans, banging them like war drums of defiance. Even small shopkeepers shuttered their stalls, choosing principle over daily bread. For a country where nearly 40% of the population lives under the poverty line, this was no small sacrifice. Yet their message was clear: no contract, however lucrative, was worth the humiliation of submission. Dignity, they declared, was priceless. International media quickly picked up the images. From New York to Doha, headlines flashed pictures of ordinary Burkinabe citizens chanting for sovereignty. What Netanyahu intended as a quiet act of coercion had become a global spectacle. The ultimatum, once whispered in the dark, was now shouted across television screens and social media feeds. Inside Burkina Faso's government, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a tense debate over survival versus resistance was now reinforced by an unexpected force: the will of the people. Ministers who once worried about the cost of sanctions saw with their own eyes that ordinary citizens were ready to endure hardship if it meant protecting sovereignty. The people were not demanding compromise. They were demanding courage. This groundswell of solidarity also unsettled those abroad who had expected compliance. Analysts in Washington and Brussels began to privately admit that Traoré's defiance posed a challenge not only to Israel's demands, but to the entire architecture of neo-colonial pressure. If one of Africa's poorest nations could resist, what message would that send to others? The 48-hour countdown ticked on each passing hour, layered with tension. Rumors swirled of Israeli diplomats seeking back-channel talks. Financial experts predicted sanctions that could cost Burkina Faso up to $500 million annually. Yet the streets remained calm, not because fear had vanished, but because unity had replaced it. Families gathered in prayer circles. Students organized candlelight vigils. Workers whispered the same conviction: we will not be sold. By the 45th hour, a subtle shift was visible. The tone from Tel Aviv softened. Offers of dialogue began to replace the language of ultimatums. The threat that had once loomed like a storm cloud seemed to be breaking apart. But Traoré refused to bend. His public declaration was short but unyielding. Burkina Faso doesn't surrender. What Netanyahu had intended as a show of force had instead created a movement of defiance. The ultimatum was no longer a private matter between two leaders. It had become a continental test of whether Africa's future would be decided by external threats or by internal resolve. And in those final hours, it was Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country, often dismissed as powerless, that carried the weight of an entire continent's dignity. The hours that followed Netanyahu's ultimatum unfolded like a national trial by fire. Every tick of the clock carried both fear and resolve. Radios buzzed with speculation, markets hesitated, and international observers wondered aloud whether this small West African nation would crumble under the weight of pressure. But in Wagadugu, something very different was happening. Instead of collapsing, the people of Burkina Faso were rising. At the 24th hour, rumors began circulating that Israeli diplomats were exploring back-channel negotiations. Analysts in European capitals speculated about sanctions packages that could strip away as much as $500 million in aid and trade annually. By the 36th hour, financial institutions prepared for capital flight, expecting Burkina Faso's fragile economy to buckle. Yet on the ground, the picture was not one of panic. Families were gathering in prayer, students were holding vigils, and neighborhood elders were quietly reassuring younger generations that their sacrifice was not in vain. By the 45th hour, a remarkable shift had taken place. Tel Aviv, once issuing threats of regime change, began signaling compromise. Language that once bristled with ultimatums softened into cautious offers of dialogue. The sudden reversal revealed something profound: intimidation had met its limit. But for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, soft words were no substitute for sovereignty. His reply remained uncompromising: Burkina Faso does not surrender. Then came the 48th hour. Midnight struck. The world braced for chaos: jets in the sky, soldiers on the move, or the swift unraveling of a government under siege. But none of it came. Instead, there was silence. Extraordinary silence. No attack, no overthrow, no retaliation. The ultimatum had dissolved not with violence, but with Burkina Faso still standing firm. The reaction was electric. Across Wagadugu, citizens who had spent 2 days waiting anxiously now poured into the streets. Market women who had marched with pots and pans turned their rhythm into a celebration. Students painted walls with the number 48, transforming fear into a badge of pride. Whole neighborhoods erupted in chants. 48 hours. Try 48 years. Politically, the standoff had changed the equation inside Burkina Faso. What began as a gamble by Traoré had become a unifying moment for the nation. Opposition voices who once criticized his government found themselves swept into the current of popular pride. Instead of isolating him, the ultimatum had strengthened his legitimacy at home. The message was clear when tested: the people stood with their leader. Regionally, the ripple effect spread quickly. In Bamako, Mali's government declared the ultimatum a warning to all Africa and reaffirmed its alliance with Ouagadougou. Students in Niger marched carrying Burkinabe flags. In Ghana's parliament, debates erupted over whether foreign coercion should be formally condemned. Chad's civil society groups organized protests demanding African unity. For the African Union, often criticized as slow and bureaucratic, the crisis became a defining moment. An emergency session was convened not to mediate between two sides, but to defend the principle of sovereignty itself. Out of these discussions emerged the seeds of what diplomats began to call the Wagadugu Protocol, a continental pact against ultimatums and political blackmail. In those 48 hours, the political landscape of Burkina Faso, and indeed of Africa, shifted. A threat meant to break the nation had instead solidified its spirit. Ordinary citizens living on less than $3 a day had stood firm, proving that unity could outlast intimidation. What began as a phone call in the middle of the night ended as a testament to Africa's enduring fight for dignity. The reverberations of Burkina Faso's defiance were not confined to West Africa. In Washington, analysts who had long assumed that small African nations could be steered through aid packages and sanctions suddenly faced a new reality. The traditional playbook: contracts, pressure, and threats had failed. American policymakers quietly admitted that if intimidation no longer guaranteed compliance, then the very architecture of Western leverage in Africa was weakening. Europe, too, watched with unease. Energy companies that once viewed African resources as stable assets recalculated risk. Contracts worth billions were no longer guaranteed if governments followed Traoré's example and put sovereignty ahead of profit. Financial institutions began to acknowledge that African states, once fragmented, were slowly discovering the strength of solidarity. The African Union's swift adoption of what became known as the Wagadugu Protocol stunned international observers. Modeled loosely on NATO's Article 5, it pledged that an attack or ultimatum against one African state would be treated as a threat to all. For decades, critics had dismissed the AU as toothless. But now, for the first time, the body signaled that sovereignty was not only a principle, but a collective defense. Globally, the symbolic impact was even greater. In Latin America, activists in Caracas and La Paz launched campaigns titled Sovereignty First, explicitly inspired by Burkina Faso's refusal to yield. In Asia, voices from Jakarta to Manila began citing the Wagadugu Protocol as proof that the global South could resist external dictates. The so-called Wagadugu effect was no longer just African, it was international. Culture amplified the message. Afrobeat musicians released tracks blending defiant lyrics with rhythms that spread across the continent. Graffiti artists in Accra and Lagos painted the number 48 on walls, transforming a countdown of fear into an emblem of pride. Even children in schoolyards chanted it, turning geopolitics into generational memory. What began as a midnight phone call had become art identity and anthem. For the United States, the challenge was more subtle but no less serious. Officials worried that the solidarity sparked in West Africa could accelerate the drift of nations toward alternative partners, Russia, China, and regional blocs like BRICS. Economists in New York calculated that if just 5 African nations redirected even a quarter of their resource exports into local processing and regional trade, the continent could add $120 billion annually to its GDP. That shift would make Africa not just a supplier of raw materials, but a future industrial hub potentially outside Washington's sphere of influence. Yet there was also an opportunity. Some American commentators argued that this was a moment for the U.S. to reconsider its relationship with Africa, not as a patron imposing conditions, but as a partner respecting sovereignty. Could Washington learn that dignity once defended is a more powerful currency than aid or sanctions? Or would it cling to the old habits of coercion and risk losing Africa altogether? For the wider world, Burkina Faso's stand delivered a blunt lesson. Intimidation is temporary, but sovereignty, once claimed, becomes permanent. And the fact that one of Africa's smallest, poorest nations had sparked this conversation sent a message far louder than Netanyahu's ultimatum ever could. When the clock struck past the 48th hour, the world expected chaos. Instead, what followed was silence, an extraordinary silence that carried more weight than any explosion. No jets thundered over Wagadugu, no soldiers marched, no regime toppled. The ultimatum that was meant to intimidate dissolved into nothing, while Burkina Faso stood taller than ever before. What Netanyahu intended as a display of power had become a lesson in its limits. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was more than survival. It was victory. A nation where millions live on less than $3 a day had stared down a global power and refused to bow. The symbolism was undeniable. Bullies are only strong when their victims are afraid. Once fear is broken, leverage vanishes. In those 48 hours, ordinary citizens turned fear into defiance, defiance into unity, and unity into dignity. But the story does not end in Burkina Faso. The ripple effect has already begun. Across Africa, voices are asking if one small nation can resist, why not us? From Ghana's parliament to Mali's streets, from Chad's civil society to the halls of the African Union, the ultimatum has awakened a movement. The Wagadugu Protocol is only the beginning. What could follow is a continental architecture of independence, economic, political, and cultural strong enough to withstand the pressures of the 21st century. And yet a warning must be heard. Intimidation may have failed once, but those who seek to control Africa's destiny will not simply walk away. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, frozen accounts, these weapons are already being used. The battle for sovereignty is no longer fought only with armies, but with data, finance, and narrative. If Africa is to stand, it must be ready for every front. Which brings us to the question, what about the United States? Can Washington accept a new Africa that refuses ultimatums, or will it cling to old habits and lose an entire continent to new partners? For older Americans watching, this moment should resonate deeply. It echoes the struggles of your own history, moments when principle mattered more than comfort, when dignity was defended even at great cost. So I ask you, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's stand marks the beginning of a lasting transformation, or is it only a brave defiance soon to be tested again? Can Africa turn 48 hours of resistance into 48 years of sovereignty? If this story has moved you, please share it. Let others know that truth is rising from Africa. And if you believe that dignity is worth more than dollars, subscribe to this channel. Because in a world where intimidation fades, but courage endures, your voice, your awareness, and your solidarity matter more than ever.